Good morning all, and welcome to this, a Thinking on Disability Inclusion in Business. My name's James Harding, I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise, and if you've not been to a Thinking before, I should perhaps explain that the idea of it was very simply to take the model of a news meeting, of my old world from the Times newspaper, a leader conference, and try and get after some of those issues in our lives and our world that are complicated and difficult and often persistent, and see whether we can work out what we think, and ideally even better what we can do about them. And this thinking this morning is in that spirit. Now, the title is "Are Business Leaders Stalling Over Disability Inclusion?" Now, I don't think you're going to need the sage group of people that we've got to come together to give you an answer to that. It's yes. So I don't want to spoil the outcome of the discussion by saying that, but the purpose of it is actually to drive thinking around, well, how do you change that? How do you change that? And we've got a group of people with us. We're really fortunate. Tanni Grey-Thompson, I don't know how you do it, Tanni. After you get past 10 gold medals, we just stop counting. I think that's the system. I think otherwise it just looks just too much for the rest of us to cope with. So thank you, Tanni, for getting up early and joining us. Caroline Casey. Caroline and I met weirdly, I think when she was just launching the Valuable 500. It was pre-press release day. And Caroline, the thing that I remember thinking is, oh my God, I can't believe that there's not an effort to try and identify those 500 companies leading the way on disability. But also just to say hats off to you, because it's an amazing thing to watch a campaign go from being somebody's idea to an actual thing. And it's become a very powerful force. So we're delighted, Caroline, that you're here, and excited to hear what's working, but as interestingly, what's not. Jeff Dodds, the COO of Virgin Media, and the thing that's interesting, of course, is that Jeff, as a manager and a leader, has been one of the people in business who's thought most vocally about this. So Jeff, I'm excited to hear from you. And Steve Hatch, whom some of you will know, who is the Executive Vice President for Europe, which essentially means runs Europe and this part of the woods for that small business rarely in the news called Facebook. And but Steve, one of the things that's most interesting, I suppose, is you really are at the intersection of a big company, the meeting of large numbers of consumers, and society in terms of the way in which we think about this. So we're delighted to have you too. So thank you all for joining us. But I give that rather kind of expansive introduction to our wise owls joining us this morning, because the point of a thinking is, of course, that everybody weighs in. My colleague Liz Mosley is going to marshal the chat this morning. Many of you will know Liz, the members editor and the fellow partner here at Tortoise. We've got live captioning this morning. Liz will explain in the chat how it works, and also with comic or undesirable effects, how it sometimes doesn't work. So do take a look at that. But most importantly, please weigh in this conversation. As we said, we're leading the witness in the question. What we want to come to at the end is something of a to-do list. It should be something like an argument at the end that says, yes, business leaders are dragging their feet on disability inclusion, but there are things that we all can do, and we're trying to understand what those might be. But Tanni, maybe we can start with you, just to give a sense of where you think we are on this, because I remember we had a conversation at the CBI annual conference where one of the things that you said was the world really hasn't moved since, in quarter of a century since the Disability Discrimination Act. So can you explain why you think that?
Well, sort of back when the DDA came in, January the 1st last year, we were all promised completely accessible transport in the UK. And then in January 2020, we were told we're going to have to wait until 2070 for accessible trains. So, that's one part of it. Back in the original legislation, which was the Sick and Disabled Persons Act, back in 1970, that talked about measuring pay for disabled people. Most companies still don't measure disability pay gap. A lot of companies don't even measure the number of disabled people that they have. So, those are some of the challenges. But I think also, and this is one of the stories I told, was, before lockdown, I was on the tube and it was rush hour. And somebody said to me, "You want to travel on the tube when it's quieter?" It's like, yeah, I'm going to work. Yeah, but it's very busy because it's the rush hour. Yep, it's 7:30 in the morning. And I said, oh, I'm off to work. I work in Westminster. Anyway, long story short, they carried on. So I just said, actually, I work in Parliament. I'm actually off there today. I'm going to defeat the government. I'm going to take over the world. I'm going to move into number 10 and become a dictator. And I said, oh, that's lovely. But could you travel when it's more quiet? No. And it was like that moment where you go, you are not listening to a word that I've said. And that was kind of quite a pivotal moment for me, just to remind me we haven't come as far as I think a lot of us had hoped.
And just out of interest, Tanni, when you get into the House of Lords itself, what is the Palace of Westminster like as an employer?
It's probably the most inclusive place I've ever worked. So in a building which is, 300 years old and more in places, I can get to every single part of the building. And genuinely, it's a place I've never been patronised or treated differently for being a wheelchair user. I can't say that in other roles that I've had. So it is a strange place, but once you're there as a peer, you're just there as a peer.
Interesting. So I'm going to come to Caroline in a moment, but can you kick us off, Tanni, if you did become that dictator? By the way, it seems that Anthony Cope in the chat is quite keen on that. I like the fact that he's scaling you back from being dictator to PM. So maybe that's better. But what would you actually do on this if you were trying to mandate the behaviour of business, big and small, as regard disability inclusion? What would you make requirements?
It's got to come from the top down in terms of understanding about the benefits of employing disabled people. This is not, charity. It's not pat on the head. It's actually a business case, as diversity is. But start measuring the number of disabled people you have. Start looking at things like pay gap. However uncomfortable some of those things are, it's too easy to just push it down the line and say we'll do it in a couple of years, or just ignore it. And there are fairly simple things you can do in terms of recruitment and bringing people in, and actually just having open conversations about accessibility and reasonable adjustment. Actually, the reality is most reasonable adjustment costs virtually nothing. It's the assumption of reasonable adjustment that puts people off. And Scope did some research a while ago which just said, actually a lot of people have never spoken to a disabled person or are frightened of speaking to a disabled person. If we flip that to any other protected characteristic, it would be that wake-up moment. But when we talk about disability, we don't seem to have got to that wake-up moment yet where there's an opportunity to drive real change.
And I assume that you were in favour of mandatory gender pay gap reporting. Are you in favour, and I'm assuming, I don't know, but are you in favour of some kind of mandatory disability reporting in business?
Absolutely, because if companies don't need to do it, and the reality is most companies know that their disability pay gap reporting, it's not great, or their pay gap's not great, they'll try and avoid doing it. Yeah. Because it's uncomfortable. And that's what we need to get over, is saying, okay, it's uncomfortable, but how can you change it? How can you improve it? And unless you measure it, it's really difficult to change it.
And one of the arguments, Tanni, that people have over mandatory disability pay gap reporting is our privacy issues and the rights of certain people not to, or people if they choose not to, report their disabilities. What do you say to that?
Yeah, well, a lot of disabled people don't want to report, or if they don't feel they need reasonable adjustment, they feel very uncomfortable because they mostly think they'll experience discrimination in the workplace. Right. So that's about changing culture, about it being a place where people do want to report or feel comfortable reporting. Some of it, I think, depends on the size of the business. If you've got 50 employees, it's much harder potentially to self-declare than in a bigger business. But it's about just having a culture where people feel that they can talk about these things.
All right. Well, I'm going to come back in the course of the conversation, Tanni, but I wanted to bring in Caroline because, of course, Caroline, in the framing of the Valuable 500, you've grappled with exactly these questions, right? Which is, what is reasonable to expect of companies? So, what would you think the companies should do?
I think one of the most important things a company can do is have a leader that is accountable for the culture of their organization. And I say that because we know that leaders make choices and those choices create culture. But we also know that 54% of our leadership and our boards have never had a conversation about disability. So how on earth are we going to get that right in business if the leadership is holding that cultural point? Mm-hmm. With the Valuable 500, look, we started as a campaign, which is incredible. We wanted to elevate the conversation of disability to board and leadership level. We wanted to close that gap on 54%. We believe that if the conversation is at leadership level, the business will then further invest in some of the great practices that are already being done. But when a leader turns their head away, the business doesn't work. It doesn't work to what the leader is ignoring. And for us, when we started, we said, okay, if we could get more companies speaking at the board level, then we could see system change within business. So in some ways, we want to break the circuit. We wanted to break the silence. We wanted leaders to speak about it. We wanted leaders to be accountable. Our job was to get their attention and intention. We don't expect them to have it right, not at all. We don't expect them to know how to do it, but we do expect them to do something and not delegate it down into the business, which is already, the diversity and inclusion agenda is already full to the brim, where disability has remained on the sidelines, off the table, with a complete lack of understanding, not just about the talent that people with disabilities bring to a business, but the opportunity for growth and innovation and design. And we have to remember 72% of our global population through a mother and father is directly affected by disability. Like, this is a small thing.
And so I guess my question is whether or not you're being ambitious or demanding enough in that, listening to you, it's possible to say that, 20 years ago, people would have said the same thing about women in the workplace, that people would demand that the boards and that the chief execs were addressing this issue. And after about 20 years, campaigners got fed up and said, look, just looking for leadership is not going to be enough. We're going to have mandatory reporting requirements. There's got to be a different kind of pressure on the boardroom. And I just wonder what you think on that.
Well, look, don't be fooled by the smiling face. There's a gritty spine behind this. I have a lived experience of disability. And actually, before we launched the Valuable 500, I was tired, I was fed up, I was angry. I've been working in the space a long time. I'm an ex-employee of Accenture. I hid in the closet about my sight. 20 years ago, I came out of the closet about being registered blind. And what really frustrates me, James, is that when we did this research with EY, 7% of our leaders in business have lived experience of disability, but 4 out of 5 of them are not declaring. Look, what has happened in 20 years? So don't be fooled. But I don't believe that we will achieve great sustainable change if all we do is walk away from what's difficult, or all we do is shout or be angry and give out. What I believe is we need to start putting pieces in place around accountability. And I fundamentally believe unless leadership is at this table, unless the leading brands in the world, because who are the leaders in the world? The scale of the disability inequality crisis is too large for governments and charities to fix on their own. They can't do it. The leaders of today, the leaders that are going to get stuff, is business. And I'm not even asking business to do it because it's a worthy or a good thing to do, because it's got money behind it, it's got opportunity behind it, it's worth 8 trillion. This is a market worth 8 trillion. In the UK alone, it's 249 billion. Now, I ask a leader, why are you willing to invest in the 100,000 vegans instead of the 15% of your base which have a disability? So in some ways, it's trying to use our head and our heart and show ways forward, and measurement is one of them. And I do want to acknowledge what Tortoise have done. You were the first sustainability index to put metrics on disability in. Was it easy? No. Is it perfect? No. But you're willing to start and to try and continue. And what I will say is, I think we're dialed up now. Sometimes I've heard back going, well, listen, we're going to, as a company, deal with who's more angry or whose voice is louder. Well, don't underestimate the absolute volume of the voice of people with disabilities. Look at that younger generation, the generation that companies want as consumers and talent. They're talking about disability pride. They're talking about saying that we are the consumer base that you want. And if you do your figures and you add up your maths, we say 15% of our population. No, it's not 15%. It's 15 to 20% with mum and dad. That's a 72% of your consumer base. Hear that noise.
Yes.
Listen to it dial up.
Caroline, I want to go back to that question about the market and the relationship between, you know, the sort of the best behavior and the impacts on the market. But it would be odd not to just respond to the fact that one of the people in the chat, as you were talking, was talking about her experience. It maybe I would normally bring them on screen, but actually they've put their name as Jane Asterisk, which I assume means that they're speaking anonymously and would rather speak anonymously. But I just want to give you this example because it's 2021. Yeah. You know, but Tanni just described her experience on the tube, and sort of Jane talks about the trouble that she's had at work, saying they raised the disability gap, and this was people, as I understand it, in HR, and they wouldn't look into that. What's the, yeah, that's what I...
Okay, can I just say, Jane, you know what, I'm sitting here and I don't want, I know what you mean, but the problem is because it's in HR, because you're the leadership of the business does not know disability performance. First of all, inclusion and diversity shouldn't be in the remit of HR alone. Actually, I think diversity and inclusion should be right across the function of the business. Actually, it should be in marketing, it should be in finance, and it should be reporting into the sustainability of the business, which is leadership. You're absolutely right. When it's held in HR, there's a million reasons for it not to exist or for something to be more important. And one of the things that I get frustrated about is I have a disability and I'm a woman. So when you hear business say, well, this year we're focusing on gender and maybe in 2022 we'll do disability and give it our focus and our intention, you go, well, so which part of me today are you going to work with? The disabled part or the gender part? So I think the conversation that I'm hoping that we're going to start emerging from COVID is the intersectionality, which is a big word for human beings. And I think what we should be aiming for is empowering and enabling cultures for everyone, where it is not at the remit of HR, because the word disability is a very small word to cover an awful lot. And 80% of disability is invisible. And that is a huge problem.
Yeah, and I just wanted, just so you can hear it, Caroline, what Jane said was, I was informed that there aren't enough people within my grade to look at it fairly, and it's bigger, and it's about skills and experience and everything. And I'm just sure there are lots of people who are going to be listening this morning and think, oh yeah, I know that story, where there's a technical or bureaucratic reason why you can't, quote unquote, fairly look at the problem.
Well, James, can I just say the point of that is, to Jane's point, if 7% of our leaders have lived experience of disability and 4 out of 5 of them are in the closet, well, you can understand why that's happening in HR. But I just want to note to what Microsoft did just before Christmas. Their report came out around identity and how many people were identifying as a disability. It's the first time that it's been done globally. Now, there's been organizations like Channel 4 have done it, where they're starting to see the reality of their employee base. And they said it was 6.1%. When Channel 4 did it years ago after the Olympics, they thought they had 3% of their employees had a disability, and they did this anonymous census and they discovered it was 12%. So the very first thing any business can do today is find out your valuable truth. How many people have a connection to disability? And you can do it, and it is possible. You can do it anonymously. Those tools are there, and that's what one of the very first things we're going to be doing with the Valuable 500 companies in phase 2. Here's the census, no more excuses, we can help you.
And Caroline, is there a way that you can do it with a carrot rather than a stick? Rather than mandatory reporting, you say we'll incentivize reporting. And what incentives work? Well,
listen, Paul Pullman, who's our chairman, would always say what you measure, you treasure. So, and once again, this needs to come from the CEO, the board needs to have, look, if we look at the ESG model, we need to see that disability is part of that. Yeah. I think Jeff says it better than anybody, Jeff, right? You talk about a rubbery carrot or a rubbery stick, or I can't remember what it is, but I think it's a bit of both. Look, we're only innovating, we're going to fail. We have to create space for us to do this in a way that we might not get it all right, but what we can't do is keep walking away from it. And so I think we need to look at, we should not ever accept a sustainability index, a diversity index that does not mention disability. You cannot say you're inclusive in a business if you're not looking at some targets or performance at the business. And because you can't, because 90% of your companies say they're passionate about inclusion and only 4% include disability. That's not inclusion, that's a delusion. So we kind of need to have even a sense of humor about it, because it's not it's not right and it's not fair. And it's achievable to change only if we call it out.
So I wanted to come to Jeff and Steve, if I might. I'm going to come back a little bit, as I said, Caroline, to that point about the market and the way in which business behaviour will affect the way it reaches the market. But you know, we'd be cheating if we didn't get after one of the issues here, which is this point that Caroline made about disability inclusion being consistently sidelined, even within the diversity and inclusion, you know, or sustainability metrics and campaigning. And Steve, you know, I wondered whether or not you could give us a sense of, even within a company like Facebook or for a company like Facebook, in the light of the killing of George Floyd, in the light of the Black Lives Matter protest, what happens here when, you know, one particular issue dominates the agenda and realistically others that are important get marginalized?
Yeah, and I'm already scribbling notes furiously, Caroline, and I'm going to certainly use your vegan. I don't know if that exact stat was right, but I think the comparison was a really strong one. Yeah, so I'm just personally, for me at Facebook, I should say as well, I exec sponsor the differently abled group within the company, certainly for me, and we run it globally. And there's thousands of us within that group. So I really identify as well, Caroline, with that point of intersectionality that you mentioned, because it is actually an incredibly powerful group for creating connections across the company. So the amount of people that I work with in that group, that they're also in the Black at group, the Women at group, the Latin at group within. So there is a real powerful moment in there, and a community that's able to kind of influence very, very widely. And in terms of thinking about it from a business context, James, and how it really comes back, I think kind of at the heart of this, there's actually an inclusive environment for everyone makes the difference. You know, and it makes a difference for everyone. So to some extent, I think it is true that organizations, and I can certainly say that with Facebook, we started with gender. We started very, very strongly with gender, and then we moved into other areas of inclusion, particularly as it became really clear that it was really important to the people that worked at Facebook. Like, you know, hang on a minute, I want representation here. I want to make sure my voice is heard in the shaping and the structuring of the company, and I want to make sure that we are taken seriously. So I think every company's on a journey. I mean, Facebook's 17 years old, and really our diversity and inclusion agenda is probably 7 years old. If I really think about when we got really purposeful about this, and there's been 3 things that have really shaped that. One, the internal community, the one that I've touched on already. And by the way, this is really important when it comes from a perspective of recruiting, because if you want to recruit the very best in the world right now, and you are not seen as an employer who values inclusion in its fullest form, you're punished for that. You know, and that, the degree of allyship you see. I mean, I say I particularly focus on differently abled for my reasons of kind of hearing loss, and also historic kind of family and personal experience of mental illness as well, because there is a degree of visible and non-visible nature of disability as well, which makes it, I think, probably an extra layer of complexity. But if you're not seen as being an organization that is for inclusion, you're not going to get the very best people when you are looking to, you know, attract, grow, and retain. The second part of this is the people that we work with, our customers in a way at Facebook, particularly advertisers, and that's in the many, many millions, and hundreds of thousands of those are people that come from disabled founded organizations, or people have experience of disability. And now I remember very vividly going to a veterans event that we ran. So this was for people within the former armed service people, for them setting up their own businesses. And it really highlighted to me the steps that you need to make if you want to demonstrate that you're an inclusive business. Yeah, of course we had ramps, but there was captioning, and there was also signing, and in addition to that as well, kind of quiet rooms for those people that are experiencing PTSD. So the amount of learning you can take from real world experience of talking to people, and these were customers in this sense, about making sure they're feeling happy. And then the last part of that is serving the widest community. I mean, there are hundreds of millions of people who identify as being differently abled across Facebook, and and that I know we probably want to touch a bit more on market later on, James, but that has a real influence on how you build a product. You know,
I'm interested to know. I'm interested to know whether that's true, to be honest, whether or not I buy Caroline's point about the scale of, if you like, the addressable market, the number of people affected by disability, right? But is there a read across from the number of people that you employ who are differently abled to that 72%? Or is it one of those things that, forgive me, Caroline, campaigners use as an argument, but it doesn't necessarily make much difference to the bottom line? And for companies that have got, you know, understandably quite a lot on their minds, this is not going to have a discernible impact on the success of their business.
I think it's hard to extrapolate. I don't think that, I haven't seen, and there isn't intention to get a calculation of, okay, this is this person and they're in this category, therefore we need to build to, I don't know, help more people. But certainly if the goal that that we have around building community, and certainly the kind of global reach that we have, it absolutely does impact on how we think about designing product. And yeah, but I think the big, if you think about the biggest changes of how people communicate over the last few years, the biggest real shift is a move from text-based communication, you know, the written word, to visually based communication, whether that's in video or that's in photos. So in many ways, that's great because it enables people to express themselves. But if you're blind and partially sighted, that's actually, an increasingly limiting factor, because you're just, you're not getting the text or description of what someone's doing, you're getting a picture. Mm-hmm. So, that means, people like Matt King, who's one of my heroes at Facebook, who's in the accessibility team, they look for the application of AI to create word descriptions of imagery. And I remember he showed me this test where it was his friend who posted, the post said, Friday night splurge. And your mind can go, if that's all you're hearing, because the text is still there, and actually the kind of audio description of the text is pretty good these days. But if all you're hearing is Friday night splurge, you can, your mind can go into all sorts of places of what that splurge, might have been. Yeah. But when it says, this picture contains food, pizza, those two words, all of a sudden create a much, not perfect, I have to say, and this technology isn't where it necessarily needs to be to give the fullest possible description. But seeing the difference between snow and sand is very hard if you're a computer. Very easy if you're a person, hard if you're a computer. But even just having those few words of high accuracy really increase that person's experience. And a company like Facebook, with the scale we've got, this is hundreds of millions of people that you're looking to serve. So the answer, I think, is yes, James. It does go back to what the goals of an organization is and how you're fulfilling those goals. Yeah. And then have you got the right people in the organization to help you do that?
Yeah, and also I think it's fair to say that the requirements, the expectations on you are higher because you create the ecosystems whereby so many other companies and so many other businesses operate. I'm going to come back to some of those business questions in a moment, but I did want to bring in Jeff. Jeff, thank you for waiting quite so patiently. But Jeff, Caroline's point at the top was actually the first thing is, who are the leaders? How do they address this? And I just wanted to get a sense from you of your experience of good and bad in this. Who does it well and who doesn't?
Yeah, hi James. First of all, I applaud you. I've never heard anybody say to Caroline, "Are you being demanding enough?" I fear we'll all live with the consequences of you asking that question now, James. It's a great question, and I think the opening of this call started with, are we putting off disability inclusion? And I think there are two types of leaders. There are those leaders, and none of them will be on this call, of course, because they've chosen to join this call, but there are the ignorant leaders who are not well educated on the topic of inclusion, and therefore it's never even crossed their mind to prioritize it. There are those that are making very conscious choices to put it off, of course, and they're the ones who I encourage to look in the mirror in the morning and ask themselves what on earth they think they're doing. And I think we have to address both of those. And my experiences of great leaders are leaders that understand what it takes to create a culture where people feel like they belong. That's it, as simple as that. Whether it's the workforce or the customer base, If they can create an environment and a culture where the people turn up to work feeling like they belong, that they can thrive, that they can realize their potential, and customers want to associate with the business because they feel they have shared values with the business, for me, that's the greatest type of leadership.
And what do you say to those people? Because there's certain kind of leaders who also they're problem solvers, right? They're faced with a problem. Let's see if we can fix it.
Yeah.
And the reality is that when it comes to gender, when it comes to race, in terms of employment, and particularly at senior levels, these are much more widely measured now, and therefore CEOs and people on boards are much more likely to respond. What do you say to those people who say, look, it's one thing to create a culture and an environment, but until we start putting disability on the same, giving it in effect within a company the same status as race and gender, we're not really going to get very far.
Yeah, look, I think one of the the phrase that's used now a lot is intersectionality. We tend to talk about belonging because we think it's language that people find more familiar or understand more clearly. I think one of the great, I hate to use the term mistakes, because people tend to look at individual characteristics because they think that's a good starting point, and it's a way of them getting into focusing on inclusion. But by doing that, of course, what they do is they focus on those characteristics as verticals in the business. And Caroline puts it perfectly when she talks about, if you have a Black disabled woman working in the organization, telling her that you care about her Blackness, but not the fact she's a woman for this year, it's utterly ludicrous. If you try and conceive what that means, it's ludicrous. So instead of breaking the characteristics down by vertical, my encouragement would be to look at inclusion as the vertical in of itself. And that way you're encompassing all forms of difference. I think to bring it back to that point on leadership, though, the most authentic leaders are the ones that tend to crack the code on this, because they're able to talk about their personal lived experience and they're able to translate that into the organization. I think it's very difficult for an organization if the leaders don't talk about their own personal experience, whether that's with disability, whether it's with ethnicity, whether it's with gender bias, whatever it happens to be with. If they can't talk about their own experience, then it's very difficult to capture the imagination of the organization. But we start.
And sorry, Jeff, can I ask you one thing? I mean, you sit at the top of a very, very big business too. The thing that Caroline said about 4 out of 5 people in senior positions not disclosing their own disability, that's just amazing to me. I mean, apart from the issue that it raises overall for, disability inclusion, just as a, responsible and honest manager, it seems odd to me that you wouldn't share that information, because it's going to have an impact on the people that you're working with. Yeah,
I think it's very easy to judge, and I think people's personal circumstances are all different. First of all, I would say disability is quite unique amongst all of the different characteristics, in that it's much more complex. So often there are people with the same disability. Some people would recognize and associate as having that disability. Other people choose not to, or simply don't recognize it as a disability. Very nuanced, very complex. If you think about something like LGBTQ+, in its nature, 7 or 8 categories that people could identify with. Disability will be thousands, tens of thousands of different disabilities. So I do think it's more complex. But I also think, I agree with you, by the way, 100%, which is the more we choose to talk about this, the more open we are. And actually, I think COVID to some degree has helped organizations to be more authentic and more open with each other as they felt more vulnerable. But I absolutely feel and agree with you that the more leaders that choose to step off the edge and choose to give more of themselves and be more authentic, the faster that dialogue opens up and the faster we make progress. And we have absolutely experienced that in our business.
Yeah, that is a really good point, Jeff, about COVID. It's the first time in my working life you can call up someone who's the boss of a big business and say, how are you? And they say, I'm feeling really flat. I'm really worried. Everyone in the business is tired and demoralized. That kind of endless boosterism has sort of had its day.
we talk quite a lot as I did a call with I'll share this, and I'm sure they won't mind me sharing it, but with my leadership team of 8 very, very senior people, rarely do I have a call with them where it's more of a how are you doing call, and we do quite a lot of those where there aren't tears. So
right.
There are normally tears. There are people giving a lot of themselves in terms of how they're feeling. But also I've noticed, whereas we used to say to people, how you doing? And the answer would be, yeah, I'm fine, thanks. And we'll get into business. The how you're doing question now often is asked more than once, because people want to really check how they're doing. And often it isn't how are you doing? It's questions like, how's your mental health at the moment? Because people recognize the pressure on areas like mental health. And I feel like we're a kinder organization as a result of COVID. I worry that post-COVID we'll revert back to type. And of course, our great challenge is to harness and to ensure that we keep some of that goodness we've learned over the last year and keep that ball in the air.
Of course, Jeff, thanks. I want to start bringing people, because there's been so much to talk about, and there have been so many comments in the chat that I'd love to start bringing them in. I wanted to bring in Assad Duna, if I might, because Assad makes a point, and I'm going to come to Catherine Bear and Anthony Cope. And Tanni, I just want to ask you to keep an ear out, because the points that Assad and Anthony make, I think, given our sort of shared experience at the BBC, certainly sounded a little familiar. Assad, do you want to just kick off? You made a point about business and fear, which interests me.
Yeah. Hi, James. And a lot has resonated here. So I run a consultancy called The Unmistakable, and we do what Caroline talked about, make diversity everyone's business. So take it out of HR and look at how does inclusion fit across an organisation. And I think one of the things that we see time and time again is that when it comes to D&I, particularly around race at the moment, but around the other characteristics, that people are very scared about what they can and can't say. And in creative fields in particular, this leads to either really misjudged or misguided work, or people not taking risks. And so how are people helping their senior leaders through that fear and through the difficulty that they might have of not knowing the words, not having a lived experience themselves, not really grappling with it? I'd just be keen to hear people's views on that, because it's something that I've seen that we've had to grapple with a lot of our clients, of gaining that confidence, the cultural confidence to know what to say and have different points of views in their life.
Yes, and I think, and I think there are issues where people are fearful of getting involved in the conversation because they think, oh, we're going to say the wrong thing, and then before you know it, you're going to start it out trying to help, and then you're going to be in the end of some other, at worst awkward conversation, at best awkward conversation, at worst tribunal, and there is that fear that exists. I can see Caroline laughing at my own awkwardness here. I'm just going to get Anthony Cope's point. Well, I'll give you an example of what it is to be awkward in this area. So Anthony put a comment in the chat about trying to get pay rise. And I don't know whether everyone had a chance at things, but Anthony Cope, I was discriminated at work because I was gay and disabled. Guess which one got me a £20,000 payoff? Hint, I minced out of that HR office, darlings. Anthony, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you well, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I was going through a really difficult part of my life. I didn't realize at the time, but I'd had my PTSD triggered by 2 relatives dying, including my mother, and me coming out in the middle of all that. So anyway, that was an interesting year. But at the end of 2008, I was working for a multinational healthcare company that sounds like somebody working on a boat. Let's leave it at that. And basically, my supervisor decided to have a go at me because I'd been off for the previous 3 months with severe depression, and I was talking about my new boyfriend. So I decided that I wasn't going to have any of that crap, sorry for swearing. So I complained to my boss, my manager, and he immediately sent in the troops from HR. So then I was the one who got suspended. I was the one who was off for 6 months being investigated. The supervisor got off scot-free, and I ended up being shunted off with a check in my back pocket. Now, that is basically against every single HR law in the book, and it's definitely against the spirit of the disability legislation. But that's what happened to me 12 years ago. I don't think anything has changed. Do you?
And well, why don't I ask Tanni? Do you think so?
I don't think a lot has changed. But I need to sort of qualify that slightly, that there are pockets of really, really good practice. But I think it comes back to what we're saying about fear. So if somebody comes up to me and says, so what's wrong with you then? And they're 95, I'm likely to react quite differently to someone who's 35 who asks me that. But it's about the tone of voice and having some of those conversations about, okay, what do you need? What can I help with? Because actually, I think what COVID's shown is that lots of people need help in a different way. And, you know, putting that brave face on it doesn't get you through in the same way as before. You know, disabled people have been asking for working from home for years, didn't happen. Yeah. COVID happens, and suddenly, because a bunch of non-disabled people want it, it happens. But that's good. But I think we need to rethink some of those things. I think when you talk about discrimination can be a game of top trumps. I rarely experience discrimination for being a woman because, I mean, really, really rarely, because it's so much easier to book an inaccessible meeting room. And I've had that happen to me, where meeting rooms have deliberately been booked that I can't get to. And there's almost like that kind of smug sort of look. And I think some of it is it's not always easy to deal with. What I've realized in COVID, in lockdown, is the level of resilience I have that I need to live my life has kind of disappeared because I'm not meeting with idiots every single day. So going back out, I think, is going to be quite challenging. And my personal defense of it, because what usually happens is they'll say, people like you, and it comes with a pointy finger. It's really interesting how it comes. So they don't say wheelchair user, they sort of point in the general direction of my wheelchair. And my response when people say that to me is like, people like you can't do that, or, you know, people like you can't have children, or people like you can't use the tube. Or I just went, what do you mean, Welsh people? Well, sorry, can English people use it? Can French? Oh, and they go, oh, well, you know what I mean. Yeah, I do know what you mean. So for me, it's trying to challenge it, but it's not easy to be doing that all the time. And that's what I think, yeah, it's far easier to discriminate against disabled people because we're meant to be grateful that we're in work. We're not meant to fight back. We're meant to tolerate and put up with things. And I think that's where you need that kind of weighted disabled people to challenge those attitudes, because I think that's when we'll achieve change as well.
But Tanni, can I ask you, that I appreciate the point, and I think Asad's point about fear is right. And I also think, you know, Anthony's example, although he puts it with good humour, is, you know, it's just deeply shocking, right? But I wanted to put to you a different problem, which is, even if you can get over sort of an awkwardness, even if you're sympathetic in your communication, if you're in a big legacy business where you're probably reducing your overall staff numbers, and you've probably got massive problems in terms of race at the top of the business. The mix of race is probably overwhelmingly, if not entirely, white. You're probably overwhelmingly male, or at least certainly majority male, and you're going out trying to fix those problems in the recruitment and promotion in the business. And you understand the issue of intersectionality. It's not like you don't understand the problem. It's just that you're not in the position that you've got a black female disabled person that you can put in to that position. You know, they're going to be one or the other. And what tends to happen is that disabled people in the current sort of pecking order of promotion and urgency don't feature. And I don't know how you address that and make that a requirement or a priority for management. I'm not even sure, and I genuinely don't know how you do that.
Yeah, it's because sort of disability has been ignored for so many years that we don't have that pipeline. So we know if you're disabled, you need a higher level of qualification to get a job. And I think some of this comes back to some of the subliminal messages that disabled people don't contribute, that we're there as a charity to make up the numbers rather than, you know, actually being an integral part of the business. And I've been that person where someone's actually said to me, we need a woman, we need someone who's not English, some Welsh, you know, we need to actually tick loads of boxes, can you do that? And for a while I kind of do that, and I'm kind of not doing that anymore. Because actually in the sport, say it's a sporting thing, if you can't find another disabled woman that's not me, you've got a massive problem. But you've got to get to a level within your working environment where you can stand up and you can actually place some of those challenges back on others. So I think it's not easy, but as Caroline said, if it was easy, it'd have been fixed years ago. And the video that she did, which just always makes me cry every time I see it, which is, you know, you can't do one thing, oh, we'll do disability in 3 years' time. And then once you've had your year of, it's fixed. I mean, it's a bit like, I mean, the 2012 Olympics and Paralympics was stunning, amazing, incredible, the best year of my entire life. But if one more non-disabled person tells me that solved the world for disabled people, I'm going to scream, because it changed the world for a few Paralympians and some spectators, but it didn't change disability, hate crime, all the other things. So there is that bit. Well, we had the Paralympics, so we're fine now. Well, no,
I was thought it was more of an indictment, Tanni, in the sense that we all said how great we were in 2012, you know, and celebrated the Paralympics, and then sort of the risk was that we would then kind of revert, as Jeff said, to the way we behaved before, and we sort of did. Anyway, I want to just get Caroline's view, though. Sorry, Caroline, but how do you deal with this, the issues that Anthony and Assad raised about fear, and how do you deal with the well-intentioned leader or manager who's doing the cultural things you want, but is not fixing the overall mix of employment in the business?
Well, okay, I'm an over-talker anyway, but that's a big question. Okay, firstly, the creative, to Assad's point, is actually one of the greatest places we can tackle fear. And for anybody watching now who hasn't seen Diversish, which Tanni spoke to, it was a small piece of film. You can get it on YouTube. It's captioned and audio described. Have a look at it, because as that's where we can start really challenging the fear. I think creative, and so much of our work with the Valuable 500 is around, it's coming from a tradition of brand agency and creative, where humor is used, by the way. And I think through the creative, we can do it. We can also really tackle the issue and the uncomfortableness about language. Come on, we have to have this conversation. I don't know what Tanni thinks, but Tanni, jump in. You know, when Paul Pullman took over as the chair for the Valuable 500, he started, he used to talk about diffability.
What's that?
And diffability, right? And, you know, he was the CEO of Unilever, so it's a real big brand, you know, they're all about branding and everything. And I had to take Paul aside and say, Paul, please don't say diffability. And he meant it in a really good way. It came from trying to change our perceptions. But actually, it doesn't, what we're seeing now, that younger generation are saying, I have a disability and I'm proud. If you change the word around, it's the intention behind the word that's the issue. So I think we're starting to really have that conversation. It's okay to say disabled person. I'm a person with a disability. It's what we mean behind it. Yes. So that's kind of one of those ones. The second thing is I want to talk about, I want to agree with that. COVID actually has brought its horrors, but it has also brought huge opportunity. I mean, it is of no surprise that as of this morning, we're at 394 companies in the Valuable 500. Our growth has been exponential since COVID, because business know they need to future-proof against the next big reactive space. And I think that is really interesting. This is future-proofing now moving forward. And that's why we have a phase 2, because we're going to be using this community to set the system. So before we even talk about, I know you said, James, that I'm a campaigner and I use big statistics and does it deliver to the bottom line? Well, let me give you a future-proofing or a risk issue. When Domino's Pizza in 2019 went to court in the US to not make their websites accessible. That's actually what they went to. They actually went because of the idea to not make their websites accessible. Do you know what happened to their brand? It was gutted. And then on the other side of it, IKEA, when they did an ad around disability back and they won the Cannes door in June, their bottom line tripled in a month. So these are some of them. And the very last thing about leadership, which I want to come to, Jeff Dodds was the very first leader after Paul Pullman, right? To say, you know, you're crazy, but that you got something. Leaders follow leaders. And I'll tell you what the thing for me about Jeff and Paul was, and is that they actually were willing to say, I don't know how to do this. I'm not sure we have all the answers, but I know I need to.
Yeah.
And that is where the leadership is. We do not expect the leaders to have the answers. But in this day and age, with the power of that younger generation, with social media in their hands, the leaders that are willing to say, look, I don't know, but I'm willing to try. The leaders that are saying, I'm not going to get my house in order before I speak about this. That's the change. And honestly, that's the evidence that I see this morning when I wake up and go, right, we've 394 CEOs and 394 brands who are willing to say, let's do this together. That's leadership for me.
Caroline, thank you. I just want to bring in Catherine Aber, who made a point right at the top about the way businesses recruit. And I don't know, Catherine, whether you're still there and able to weigh in.
I think the point I was making that employers, by and large, are looking for their perceived straightforward candidate, the person that they look at and see somebody that will cause them the least problems, bring the most skills, and often we know employers recruit in their own image. And I think when they see, and I think people have made the point that disabled people have, often with a set of complexities at the forefront that employers find disconcerting. The truth of it, of course, is that all human beings bring their own complexities and challenges. And I think the whole conversation around intersectionality is very important, actually, because the more we understand how people are all individuals with a whole set of needs, challenges, personal lives, etc., the better we will be at recruiting effectively for our businesses. And I think the other thing I would say is that there are also real challenges in those big companies. I worked for many years for an organisation that did a lot of work in supporting employers to employ more disabled people, and actually you could often see very good examples of incredibly good talk happening at the top of big companies, and that never translating to local branches, local the local thing, and you could have I remember examples of where we had CEOs of companies leading big conversations about employment for disabled people, and there being absolutely no knowledge of that at a local branch level. I think it's also important to remember that most people are employed in SMEs, and I think it's really important that CEOs of big companies make the contribution that is being encouraged here. But we really also need to make sure that small companies absolutely understand how to get the right people in their businesses and recognise that the right people come in all shapes and sizes and all have a contribution to make.
Catherine, thank you. It's a really important point. I said to everyone before we started, I said to Steve and Caroline and Tanni and Jeff before we started, that we would leave an airy 10 minutes at the end to come up with a to-do list. Of course, I've completely failed to do that, and we have 3. But in that spirit of kind of powerful brevity, Steve, will you go first? What should be on the to-do list? And I'm going to come to Jeff, Caroline, and Tanni.
Yeah, I'd say get over the fear is definitely the message I think taking away here. And I'm really struck by this recruitment piece. We had our first referral session last year for people that identify as differently abled, and we learned a lot from it. So I think I'd say my summary, I think it is about being very intentional and then being very vocal about your bit about being very intentional. I don't think we're going to get all of this right, but I hope that's not going to stop us from trying and experimenting. And the only second point I'd make as well, which is I think companies really do have to provide the platforms for their differently abled people within their own organization. Like, give them voice, give them platform, because they're going to help drive and create not only a better culture for them and people like them who may join the business, but for the overall organization itself.
Steve, thank you. Jeff?
I had a list here, James, and I'm going to ignore it all, and instead I'm just going to respond to a couple of great things that Catherine said, actually. We've gone beyond the diverse candidate slate to having diverse interview panelists. So instead of, because what we tended to find was we would go out and have a group of diverse people come in for interview, and they'd all be interviewed by white middle-aged men. So you ended up with the wrong answer all the time. So now we focus on both, making sure we also have diverse panelists interviewing. That's one thing. A couple of tips. If for those leaders on, we use a program in our organization called Equity Sequence, which effectively encourages all the leaders in our business to ask a series of 5 or 6 simple questions before they make decisions, to ensure that they're trying to consider minority viewpoints that perhaps they wouldn't consider naturally. I would encourage everyone to go online and have a look at Equity Sequence training. Found it absolutely fascinating. And the final point would be, and I think to Catherine's point, which is, I think for leaders of the organization, it's great that we set a vision, and it's great that we have a passion for inclusion. But if we don't bookend, if we don't get stuck into understanding the action plan, measuring progress at the kind of grassroots level, it tends to dissipate through the organization and get cancelled out. So I lead our belonging agenda at Virgin Media, but I also am the person that goes through that KPI dashboard and looks at the action plan. So I try to bookend both, because I found exactly what Catherine said, which is it's great to set a vision, but if you don't get stuck in at the grassroots, then it often dissipates.
Okay, Jeff, thank you. Caroline? And Caroline, will you also tell us what we can do, if anything, to get involved in the Valuable 500?
Just get in touch with us. Firstly, of course, I'm going to say for those companies that might be here that are not part of this community, please get in touch. We'd love you. I want to nod to Catherine. Some of the greatest examples of disability business inclusion are in small and medium-sized organizations. You're absolutely right. We lose the capacity as we grow into big organizations. The second, I'm going to nod to Steve. He's absolutely right. Find out what your employee population base has to say about this subject. The intelligence is in the business. He's absolutely right. That's the first place to begin. Thirdly, I think if I was in any business, and if I could be the dictator of all businesses, make the connection between the talent in the business and the consumer base, because that's where it becomes not a stick, but you will be pulling the intelligence in the business who have lived experience of disability if you understand how it serves. And I think lastly, from my perspective, it's just begin. You know, no more excuses now. Find the best place we can get movement on this is to set targets. And I mean targets because measurement is important. Get as the leader of your business, go out and ask, find out what the targets are. And James, can you make sure that every single sustainability index or diversity and inclusion index in the world is doing what tortoise began? Because that's where I think we'll see the change.
Caroline, thank you. And Tanni?
Yeah, we need disabled people on board, senior leadership. Companies need to think about their recruitment. There are challenges for the next few years ahead for all of us in so many different ways. If you think getting disability inclusion right now is hard, it is not going to get any easier. So start it now. You know, people are understanding, you know, if it was an easy problem, it'd have been fixed years ago. You know, just start it now, because you've got an amazing opportunity to think about your business in a different way, to think about your people in a different way, and change will come. Just don't put it off.
Tanni, thank you. Listen, thank you everyone for joining this morning. I realise we're a couple of minutes over, but I hope you'll appreciate that we kicked off this year, and quite deliberately, Liz and I, when we were thinking about what's one of the first subjects we wanted to cover in 2021, it was this. And part of the reason for it has been this wish to make sure that what comes out of this thinking is a strand of campaigning journalism. We've made this point, as Caroline says, about the way in which we get better metrics on disability as part of our Responsibility 100 index. For what it's worth, I just take away 3 things. One is, I'm really struck by the fact that it's not what you say, but how you say it. This point about tone that Tanni made and that Jeff made, and just asking the how are you feeling point, and that Caroline made in saying, let's not change our language, right? Let's understand it. And that point about disabled pride, it's tone rather than language. I think it does a lot to get over the fear point that Assad made. Clearly, there is something really profound that is happening as a result of COVID. Jeff said it in terms of the culture of business, but I thought Steve's point about video and the way in which we're communicating differently is really a big thing for us to think about. It's a practical thing to think about. And then I suppose I come to the kind of core thing that Caroline's doing in just creating metrics. Creating metrics, the Valuable 500 is itself a massively important step in that direction. But I am, as you can hear, in the mandatory reporting camp, because I think this thing needs to get accelerated and as forcibly as possible. But I totally get your point, Caroline, which is the very first starting point is, let's get some targets and let's ask the businesses we're in to have some targets. And so, for what it's worth, we take that on, and I'm sure that many other companies will, not least pressed by the likes of Caroline, Tanni, Steve, and Jeff. So, a huge thank you to you all for joining us. Apologies for running over a few minutes. Stick with us in 2021. We're going to keep reporting on this and investigating, and where we can, do our bit. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a very good day.